Hey and welcome to Lost Ark with Aragon. So Lost Ark is going to launch this February on Friday the 11th. However, if you want to become a founder, you can access the game 3 days earlier by purchasing one of these packs. So what I want to do for you guys is go over the different classes within Lost Ark. You can see primarily you'll have 5 different classes, and each one will have, let's say, a branch off or an archetype where within it you can specify your role even further. For example, there you can see we have the warrior, and when you go select it, you then have 3 choices from your Beserker to your Paladin to your Gunlancer. And you can see across all of the 5 different classes, we have a total of 15 unique classes by taking these specialities. So let's go over a little bit about each of the classes and which one you should be choosing upon launch. It will primarily depend on what playstyle you prefer. One thing to note, however, is that yes, indeed, every single class is gender locked. So when you see this Beserker as a male guy here, well, that's all you're going to be able to play him as. The Paladin, also a guy, and the Gunlancer, also a guy. And you can see, for example, in the Gunner, you have, let's say, your Deadeye, who's going to be a male counterpart of pretty much the Gunslinger, which is a female. They play very similarly. So first up, we have the Beserker, and he's going to be your traditional guy who wields a great sword and goes swinging around, damaging foes with his massive blade. You'll see many of his powers will be pretty satisfying, just absolutely mowing down groups of enemies. Keep in mind though, his cooldowns are rather lengthy, so you'll want to space out your powers, or you might end up in a situation where you can't kill the enemies who are pummeling on you until a said power is off cooldown. Now the special ability of the Beserker is its identity gauge, the Fury meter. So on successful hits of enemies, you'll fill up this meter, allowing you to go into Fury mode, which upon activation will basically make you glow red, and you'll receive increased attack, movement speed, critical rate, and an access to another ability called Bloody Rush. However, you will have a cooldown upon when you can enter this state again, which is 30 seconds. Now the strength of a Beserker is that they have good high damage, very friendly to new players because they can excel at sustained damage along with burst damage in boss fights. They're very straightforward and an easy class to learn. Their weaknesses is they obtain very little party synergy, so they won't be able to buff up party members as much, and they really don't have much other utility than just dealing damage. Next up, we have the Paladin. Now the Paladin primarily wields a one-handed sword and a tome of scriptures. Now you'll have 2 different types of attacks. You'll have your primary light skills, which will be all glowy yellow, and you'll have your fencing skills, which are blue. Generally, your primal light skills will be the supportive ones, so all that golden auras and fancy tricks there that you'll cast primarily from your book, and the fencing skills will generally strictly be attack based. For the identity gauge on the Paladin, we have Scales of Fate, and this will fill up upon successful hits. When you fill up this gauge, you'll have the ability to choose between 2 unique skills. You'll have Judgment, which will be a blue skill. This will increase the radius and damage of your own attacks, or you can choose the Blessed Aura, which will be a yellow skill, which will increase the damage of your allies within a certain radius of you. Judgment you'll generally use within solo fights just to buff up your damage and kill your enemies quicker, and Blessed Aura you'll generally use when you're in party content. And as a Paladin, even if you're a new player, you'll usually find it much easier to get into pug groups because they'll be looking forward to your buffs. That is, of course, as long as you're using your Blessed Aura to buff up your party instead of yourself. So generally in PvE content, you're much better to buff your allies than just outputting your own damage, because your own damage will never come as top as, let's say, some other endgame DPS like the previously mentioned Beserker. Now the strengths for the Paladin is they can provide shields to yourself and party members, they can provide aura buffs to increase attack power along with reducing damage taken, they can provide a debuff on a target which increases the damage taken to it, and they can provide heals to yourself and also party members, and they've slightly higher damage than the other alternative for buffing party members, which is the Bard. Weaknesses, however, is they have lower overall damage compared to most DPS classes, and they have slightly lower healing and mana regeneration compared to the Bard, which we'll go over in a little bit. So from my research of the Paladin, it's going to be like the secondary buffer. Ideally you take a Bard, but if you can't, you'll take a Paladin. And lastly, we have the Gunlancer for the Warrior. Now this is going to be your bread and butter tank for the game. Currently, when the game launches with all 15 different class types, the Gunlancer is the only tank available. Albeit for most content you won't need a tank, you will just want to focus on killing things as quickly as possible. However, when you get into endgame, some raids you will need a tank to absorb the enemy's hits, especially if you're running with other DPS classes who ideally want to be behind the boss to deal maximum damage. Thus you would want somebody to draw the threat, so the boss is always facing in one direction. So you would have a Gunlancer in your group, and if you just want to be absorbing maximum amounts of damage, this would be the role for you. You will have a lance which acts as a gun as well, and also a sword. Along with that, you'll have a shield in your other hand to block incoming damage. Now the unique ability for the Gunlancer is that they have their shield gauge, which will just fill up automatically while in combat upon successful hits to enemies. And the more that it is full, the more powerful the effect of the identity skill that is used. And you can choose between either defensive stance or shield of the battlefield. Defensive stance will provide a shield around you as the player, and it protects you from being interrupted, like dazed, knockdown, stuns, so on. You'll move 50% slower though, and the gauge will constantly drain, and this can be turned off and will also expire once your gauge is basically drained. Then the shield of the battlefield is your other option. It's basically a targetable jump attack that pushes and knockdowns enemies within an area, and also absorbs all damage dealt to the player and party members within the area. This effect only lasts 5 seconds and is dependent on how full your shield gauge was when used. It has a cooldown though of 1.5 minutes, unfortunately. So the role of the Gunlancer is pretty much just the tank, mitigating damage. It is very slow and not very mobile, and thus you will take a lot of hits with regards to that anyway, but you have taunt powers which will make it so that you can make sure enemies are attacking you instead of your allies. The strength, it has very high survivability, very high burst damage, and it can provide shield to yourself and party members, removing debuffs from party members, providing a buff to increase party damage, and also providing debuffs to enemies to make it so that they take increased damage and also reduce their defense. Weaknesses is that they're very slow with their base movement, and they have a shorter range dash ability, so you won't be able to dodge around or avoid enemies' attacks as easily compared to other classes. Then we go to our overall class, the Martial Artist. You'll recognize this very similar to monk classes you may have played in other games. We can see we have 4 unique different archetypes here, and first up we'll go through the Striker. Now the Striker will wield lightweight fist weapons in each hand. You're basically a melee DPS. You'll be getting up close and personal in the faces of your targets and comboing together punches, kicks, and powerful elemental skills, throwing enemies up in the air. Now your identity gauge of the Striker is the elemental meter. So when you successfully hit enemies with basic attacks and normal skills, you'll fill this meter up. There are 3 orbs or bubbles in your meter that, once full, are the resources for special esoteric skills. Now these skills when used will consume 1, 2 or 3 elemental bubbles depending on said skill used. And as a striker you'll have a wide variety of different skills that can use up those elemental bubbles, and thus it will depend on how many they consume, and that will rate off how much damage a said skill or how powerful that skill is. So your role of a striker is just a pure DPS class. Your strengths are you have high burst damage, high mobility, and will provide attack speed to your party members. As a weaknesses, you have lower sustained damage, you have lower health and defense, and not a lot of party utilities. It can be difficult to master landing back attack abilities to maximize your damage, as bosses generally move around a lot, and if you don't have a tank, then I guess aggro will be a little bit inconsistent. Next up we have the Wardancer. Now this class again will just wield lightweight fist weapons in each hand, your melee DPS class again, and this time around you'll also again have an elemental meter which will fill up those bubbles which you will use to cast your powers. Essentially, the Wardancer is very similar in a way to your striker, just being the female counterpart. Not a big fan of this. They shouldn't really gender lock in the first place, but it is what it is. So again, you'll be able to use those elemental bubbles to cast certain powers again, and otherwise your role is a melee DPS. You can provide decent offensive buffs and also buffs to reduce damage. Your strength is you have high burst damage, high mobility, provide movement speed, attack speed, crit rate party buffs, so a bit more than the striker, and you can provide minor damage mitigation, and it's fairly easy to learn. Weaknesses, however, it has lower sustained damage and can be difficult to master landing back attack abilities, the same as the striker. Next up we have the Scrapper. Now with this class you'll be wielding much bigger and heavier gauntlets on your arms. This time around you'll have a different identity meter which will be your energy meter, and you'll basically fill this up and be able to use it either for the stamina energy or shock energy, stamina being yellow and shock being green. Your stamina skills will consume stamina energy and replenish stock energy, and your shock skills will consume shock energy and replenish stamina energy, so you'll be balancing between both of them, and so you'll use the different energy types and thus you'll output your damage that way. Now overall you have pretty good damage and you'll have high stagger and impairment skills since you're wielding a heavy weapon. You'll also have multiple counter attacks, being able to interrupt enemies, and you'll have lots of super armor, meaning you'll be able to take quite a beating before you go down. Your weaknesses, however, it can be difficult to manage your self buffs and your identity gauge, since you have kind of the two rates, which one will increase the other, and then it's the balance between which powers you are actually using. Next up, we have the Soulfist, and this is a bit of jack of all trades guy who's going to have the unique ability of its hype meter. So unlike other classes, the hype meter starts at full capacity and is usable at any time to enter the 3 stages of your identity skill. The hype mode. Activation of the hype mode restores your key energy, reduces skill cooldowns, increases attack speed, and increases damage. So instead of using mana, you will be using ki for your actual abilities when you go and cast them. Now once you're in this hype mode, you'll essentially gain the big boost depending on what level of hype you're on. If you're on level 3 hype, you'll increase your cooldown recovery by 25%, attack speed buffed by 15%, damage increased by 60%, and your duration of 20 seconds. Now you will have a fatigue period where you won't be able to enter that mode again, which will also increase depending on what level of hype mode you entered. However, you will be able to get like class engravings which can completely mitigate this fatigue time. So overall, they have one of the highest damaging powers in the game, which gives them the highest burst damage in the game. And this power is your awakening skill, World Decimation. This is kind of like your daily power if you are coming from Neverwinter, which a lot of my audience would. Now your strengths again, high burst damage, Then you're also going to have high mobility, and you can also provide attack power buffs to your party. Your weaknesses, however, you'll have lower sustained damage, so if the fight goes on for any long period of time, you'll generally fall behind in damage output compared to other DPS classes. You'll have lower health and defense, and your damage will be low if your awakening skill misses. So unfortunately, your skill has a bit of a cast time, and it's only a small area. And if somebody moves out of that area, you'll end up dealing no damage, meaning you lose out on pretty massive amounts if that doesn't hit. So next up, we go to the Gunner. The Gunner again has 4 more archetypes. Here you will have the Gunslinger, where you will wield 3 different types of guns. You'll have your pistols, shotguns, along with your rifle. They'll all have different preferable ranges to go with them. The Gunslinger is a hybrid DPS, meaning you can attack from all of those different ranges. Both ranged and melee can work for you. The identity skill of the Gunslinger is a little different. You don't have a skill, instead you will have the weapon stance switch. The Gunslinger can switch between your weapons at any time and instantaneously, and will depend on the mechanics of the fight, and you will have to choose based on what enemies you're fighting, based on what weapon you want to use, and what skills to go with those weapons. Your dual pistols will typically need to debuff the target to increase the crit of those attacking it, and additionally you'll buff players' movement and attack speed. And finally, many of the pistol abilities provide the Gunslinger with very high mobility. The shotgun will be used for close range combat, and the rifle or sniper is used for long range combat. The overall strength is you have pretty high damage, pretty high mobility with the pistol, and you can provide increased crit rate to the party. Your weaknesses, however, is you have a lower health pool, and it can be difficult to master managing all the abilities and stances, so it'd be a bit like the Ranger in Neverwinter. Next up, we have the Artillerist. As the name suggests, you're going to be using all sorts of different artillery weapons. You'll primarily wield a large heavy launcher gun, which will have a wide variety of different uses. You're a ranged DPS, so you generally want to stay away from the enemies as much as you can, or have your allies up close, and otherwise you'll have your firepower gauge, where when you successfully hit enemies, you'll fill up this meter, and there are 3 set intervals which produce bonus damage at each threshold. Once the gauge is entirely full, you'll be able to use your identity skill Barrage Mode, and this will turn the Artillerist into a stationary turret, replacing your skill bar with 4 separate bombardment skills. You have 1 shield and 3 powerful damaging abilities. So overall, again, you're pretty much a pure ranged DPS class. Your strengths are you have very high damage, you fair amount of damage mitigation, not the best but not the worst either. You have lots of super armors, and you're also pretty easy to learn with high destructive and staggering abilities. Your weaknesses, however, you have pretty low mobility, you lack any party buffs, and it can be difficult to master landing some of those delayed abilities. You're going to have to predict where the enemies are going to be for those massive damaging powers. Next up, we have a Deadeye, who's going to be pretty similar to your Gunslinger. Again, being a hybrid DPS, having those 3 different weapons you can wield, the dual pistols, the shotgun, the rifle, and thus being able to jump around between ranged and melee distances. Again, you have your identity skill of the Deadeye is your weapon stance switch, same as before we've seen with the Gunslinger. Again, you'll have your dual pistols, increasing movement and attack speed to allies, and also having nice high mobility. Same with the shotgun, close quarters, the rifle and sniper for longer ranges. Again, with your strengths, you have high damage, high mobility with your pistol, and you provide increased crit rate to the party. Weaknesses, again, is you have a lower health pool and defensive stats, and it can be difficult to master landing very close basic attacks with the shotgun. Next up, we have the Sharpshooter. Herein, you'll be wielding a mechanical bow. You'll be shooting your special arrows, and you have few melee attacks with some daggers. You'll also have a hawk companion. So again, this is like the Ranger with the bow stance. Your combat style will generally be as a ranged DPS, ideally keeping your distance so you don't get pummeled by those enemies. Your special ability is to summon your Silver Hawk. When dealing damage to targets, you'll fill this identity gauge, and once it's full, you can summon your hawk and command it to attack a target or self-destruct to deal massive area damage. So again, you're a pure DPS who'll want to keep your distance because you're a little bit squishy. Your strengths are good damage, high mobility, fairly easy to learn. Your weaknesses are you have a lower health and defense and very low party synergy. Next up, we have the Mage, which will just have two different specialities. Here, first up, we have the Bard, which is pretty much going to be your best buffer in the game. This will be the guy you will bring along to your raid to provide those massive party buffs along with a bit of healing. You're going to wield your magical harp. You're a ranged support class. A little bit squishy, so you want to keep your distance. You're going to have your serenade meter, which will fill up to 3 bars when using skills and dealing damage to enemies. The more bars that are full, the more powerful the effects of the identity skill that is used. Once it's full, you can choose to use 2 of the identity skills, your serenade of courage or your serenade of salvation. The courage one will increase damage of yourself and also your party members, and the salvation one is an area effect that heals party members standing within it. The role of the Bard is simply a support class. You're going to focus on attacking enemies at distance range while providing an increased damage taken debuff as well as an attack power buff to the party, and coming into melee range to shield and mitigate damage to party members. Your strengths are you're pretty much the best for buffing party members, providing shields to self and party members, providing aura buffs of increased attack power, and also providing aura buffs of reduced damage taken. You can debuff your targets to increase the damage they take and also provide heals to self and party members. Your weaknesses, however, is you have much lower overall damage and you're going to thus have a much harder time leveling solo. You ideally want to have a party member or 2 as DPS, which you can buff and heal and just support them while they pretty much carry you through killing everything. Next up on the Mage, we have the Sorceress. Now this is going to be your bread and butter mage, with having to wield your elemental staff and juggle between all of your different elemental magic spells. You're primarily a ranged DPS, not exactly too squishy, but you're going to be casting powers of fire, ice, lightning, and so on, filling up your arcane meter when successfully hitting enemies. Now, when this gauge is above 30%, you'll have 2 abilities available for use, your Magic Discharge and Blink, and at 100% of the gauge, your Magic Discharge will become Magic Unleashed. And while using these abilities, energy stored within the arcane gauge is consumed. Your Magic Discharge state, which is when you have 30% or more, will increase elemental damage and you'll have faster casting speed. When you have the Magic Unleashed state, so when you're 100%, you'll have increased elemental damage, faster casting speed, fire and lightning impairment skills increased by 1 level, and you'll have faster cooldown for all skills, except your dodge and quick rebound and awakening skills. Your blink will basically teleport to your mouse's position and you'll be able to pass through opponents that way as well. And your strength is you have high burst damage along with high sustained damage. You'll be able to mix and match depending on what skills you rotate through. You'll be able to provide a debuff on the target that increases target's damage taken. And overall, once you do get the hang of your different powers, it'll be fairly easy to learn compared to the other classes. Your weaknesses, however, you have a lower health pool and defensive stat, casting skills can be hard to time with delayed damage, and mobility will be sacrificed at the cost of just increasing your damage potential. And finally, we go to the Assassin. Now here we have the choice between a Shadowhunter and a Deathblade. First up, the Shadowhunter will basically have you wielding 2 double-edged daggers called Halades. Now the Shadowhunter is a mix between both ranged and melee attacks. You'll have the identity identity gauge of the Shadow Burst meter, which will fill up upon successful hits to enemies, and once full, players can activate it to enter Demonize. And this will transform the character into a demon, and you'll grant access to 6 unique demon only skills. And once in the state, you will also gain 20% increased health and movement speed, and you'll also be immune to interrupts. And once ended, the player must wait 30 seconds before you can enter Demonize again, due to the composure debuff. However, that can be entirely removed with a class engraving. The Shadowhunter is just a pure DPS class. Your strengths are you'll have high sustained damage, you'll also have high burst damage once you go into Demonize mode, and you'll have high mobility. It's fairly straightforward and an easy class to learn. However, your weaknesses are you have a lower health pool, not much utility, and only 1 short attack damage party buff. Next up, we have the Deathblade. Herein, you'll be wielding 3 swords. Well, you basically have 2 daggers and a longsword. The Deathblade is a hybrid DPS, meaning you'll be able to attack from both ranged and melee distances. You'll be able to fight with a flurry of 1,000 cuts with a chaotic fast-paced slashing style. Now, your identity gauge is the art meter. The art meter fills upon, again, just successful hits and attacks, filling up 3 levels of death orbs. Death orb can be activated once it's filled, and upon activation, the Deathblade will enter into the form known as art. And this will depend on how many orbs you activate at once. Let's say you're to activate all 3 orbs, you would gain 10% more movement, 20% more attack speed, 30% more attack power, 50% attack speed, you'll have 50% cooldown reduction, and you'll have 45% mana regeneration. And that will last also again for 30 seconds on 3 orbs, 10 seconds for 1 orb. Now the role of a Deathblade is again just pure output in damage. However, to maximize your damage, you will ideally need to be using your back attack conditions, wherein you will gain extra damage when attacking from behind an enemy. Your strengths are you have good consistent damage, good mobility, and lots of super armor. So pretty good survivability. Otherwise, you have low staggering impairment abilities, so ideally you just want to kill everything before it can hit you. But you can't knock things around or stun them as much, so therein you'll lack a bit more survivability by not being able to interrupt your enemy's attacks. Upon starting out, it can be pretty difficult to perform all of those back attacks optimally to maximize your damage. So overall, that is all 5 of those different classes along with their archetypes, 15 pretty much in total. And you will want to be making the right decision, as once you choose, there's no going back. Of course, you can always just go and make another character, and upon doing so, you can test out what playstyle you like. I would recommend messing around, see what characters you like the look of, like the sound of, just create the character. You'll end up in a tutorial period at the very beginning, which will showcase you through the abilities of the character. You'll have to make your decision on what specialization, and then you'll be able to see exactly which playstyle you prefer. Of course, if you want to go buffing, then my opinion the Bard is probably going to be the best. But if you want to mix, then you could go with the Paladin. It's pretty good buffer, can also have pretty good damage, but not as good as, say, the Bard. Otherwise, there's a whole bunch of different DPS classes, but only one tank, which is the Gunlancer. And if you want to be the tank of the party, well, that's unfortunately your only option. DPS classes will range from fast attacking speed with good armor or low armor, high mobility or low mobility, and in general you'll sacrifice certain things, whether it be having good sustained damage for burst damage, or having high sustained damage but low burst damage, or having high armor and low mobility, or having good mobility but low armor. Again, I'd like to give a massive thank you to all of my channel members who help me keep my channel going. And if I present this well, consider leaving the video a like. If you're new around here, consider subscribing. We'll see you guys around. Goodbye for now.